A shop owner told a homeless man he couldn't afford the $85,000 trumpet. The man was Miles Davis, and what happened next shocked everyone in the store. It was October 14th, 1965, and Miles Davis was walking through the streets of Chicago in clothes he hadn't changed in 3 days, looking exactly like someone who had been sleeping rough for weeks. But this wasn't homelessness. This was deliberate. Miles had been conducting an experiment in human nature that would expose the ugly truth about how people judge worth based on appearance, and he was about to teach one music store owner a lesson he would never forget. When Miles walked into Peterson's Music on State Street, the city's most prestigious instrument shop, he looked like any other desperate person seeking shelter from the cold October wind. His hair was unkempt, his clothes were wrinkled and dirty, and he carried himself with the weary shuffle of someone who had been rejected by society countless times. What the shop employees didn't know was that this homeless man had $90,000 in cash in his jacket pocket and was about to purchase the most expensive trumpet in their store. But first, he would have to endure the humiliation and discrimination that countless real homeless people faced every day. And what he discovered about human prejudice would change how he saw the world forever. This is the story of how Miles Davis disguised himself as a homeless man to expose society's judgment based on appearance, and how one music store owner learned that genius doesn't always come dressed in expensive suits. It was October 14th, 1965, and Miles Davis was experiencing one of his periodic bouts of anger about social injustice and the way society treated people based on their appearance rather than their character or abilities. He had been increasingly disturbed by stories he had heard from musicians who had been dismissed or mistreated because they didn't look like what people expected successful artists to look like. Miles had achieved enormous success by this point in his career, and his fame usually protected him from the kind of discrimination that many other African American musicians faced on a daily basis. But he had never forgotten his early experiences with prejudice, and he remained acutely aware of how differently people were treated based on their race, their economic status, and their appearance. The inspiration for his experiment came from a conversation he had with a young trumpet player who had been trying to purchase a quality instrument but had been repeatedly dismissed by music store employees who assumed he couldn't afford anything expensive. The musician had described being followed around stores, ignored by salespeople, and treated with suspicion despite having the money to make a legitimate purchase. Miles decided to conduct his own test of how people would treat someone who appeared to be homeless and destitute. He spent several days preparing for this experiment, deliberately not bathing, wearing the same clothes repeatedly, and practicing the body language and mannerisms that he had observed among people who were genuinely experiencing homelessness. On the morning of October 14th, Miles walked through the Loop District of Chicago, observing how people reacted to his appearance. Store employees watched him suspiciously, pedestrians crossed the street to avoid him, and security guards followed him when he entered buildings. The experience was both educational and infuriating for someone who was accustomed to being recognized and treated with respect. Peterson's Music was located on State Street and had a reputation as the finest instrument shop in the Midwest. The store specialized in high-end instruments for serious musicians and had a clientele that included members of the Chicago Symphony, prominent jazz musicians, and wealthy amateur players who could afford the best equipment available. Miles had purchased instruments from Peterson's before, always receiving excellent service and respectful treatment from the knowledgeable staff. But today, he wanted to see how the same store would treat someone who appeared to have no money and no social status. When Miles entered Peterson's that October afternoon, he was immediately noticed by David Peterson, the store's owner, who was standing near the front counter reviewing inventory records. Peterson looked up from his paperwork, and his expression immediately changed when he saw the disheveled man who had just walked into his upscale establishment. Peterson asked in a tone that clearly suggested he hoped the answer would be no. Miles shuffled forward, staying in character as someone who was nervous about being in such an expensive store. "I was wondering if I could look at some of your trumpets," he said quietly. Peterson's response was immediate and dismissive. "Our instruments start at several $1,000s. I don't think we have anything in your price range." This was exactly the kind of response that Miles had expected, but hearing it directed at him personally was still shocking. Peterson hadn't asked what Miles's budget was or what kind of music he played. He had simply looked at Miles's appearance and concluded that he couldn't afford anything in the store. "I've been saving money for a long time," Miles replied, maintaining his role. "I was hoping to see what you have available." Peterson clearly wanted Miles to leave the store, but he couldn't simply refuse to show him instruments without appearing overtly discriminatory. "Well, I suppose you can look," Peterson said reluctantly, "but please don't touch anything unless you're serious about buying." Peterson led Miles to a display case containing several mid-range trumpets, instruments that cost between $1,500 and $3,000. These were quality instruments, but they were far from the premium equipment that the store was famous for selling. "These are our most popular models," Peterson said, clearly hoping that Miles would be overwhelmed by even these prices and leave voluntarily. Miles examined the instruments in the display case, but after a few minutes, he looked up at Peterson and said, "Do you have anything better? These look like student instruments." This comment clearly irritated Peterson, who interpreted it as criticism from someone who he believed couldn't afford even the least expensive items in the store. "Those are professional quality instruments," Peterson said coldly. "They're more than adequate for someone who is just starting to take music seriously." The condescension in Peterson's voice was unmistakable, and Miles felt his anger beginning to build. But he remained committed to his experiment and continued playing his role. "I was really hoping to see your best trumpets," Miles said. "I've been dreaming about owning a really fine instrument for years." Peterson's patience was clearly running out. "Sir, our premium instruments cost tens of thousands of dollars. The trumpet I think you're interested in seeing costs $85,000. That's more than most people make in 2 years. Miles maintained his humble demeanor and asked quietly, "Could I just see it?" Peterson's response revealed the full extent of his prejudice and condescension. "I'm sorry, but I can't allow you to handle an instrument of that value. Insurance regulations require that expensive instruments only be demonstrated to serious potential buyers." This was almost certainly a lie. Miles had never heard of such insurance regulations, and he doubted that any existed. Peterson was simply using official-sounding language to justify his discriminatory treatment. "How do you know I'm not a serious potential buyer?" Miles asked, still maintaining his character. Peterson looked at Miles with barely concealed contempt. "Sir, I've been in this business for 25 years. I can tell when someone is a serious customer and when someone is just wasting my time. I suggest you look at the instruments in your price range and make a decision." This was the moment that Miles had been waiting for. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick roll of cash, $90,000 in $100 bills that he had withdrawn from his bank account that morning specifically for this experiment. "Will this be enough for the $85,000 trumpet?" Miles asked, placing the money on the counter. Peterson's expression changed immediately from condescension to shock to confusion. He stared at the money for several seconds, clearly trying to process what was happening. Where did you get this money?" Peterson stammered. Miles smiled for the first time since entering the store. "I earned it playing music. My name is Miles Davis." The recognition hit Peterson like a physical blow. His face went completely pale as he realized that he had just spent the last 20 minutes insulting and dismissing one of the most famous jazz musicians in the world. "Mr. Davis, I didn't recognize you." "No, you didn't," Miles replied, his voice now carrying the authority and confidence that Peterson should have recognized from the beginning. "But that's not the point," You didn't recognize me because you never bothered to look past my clothes and my appearance. You decided I was worthless based on how I looked." Peterson began to apologize profusely, but Miles held up his hand to stop him. "I want to buy that $85,000 trumpet," Miles said. "But first, I want you to understand something. Every day, people walk into businesses like yours and get treated the way you just treated me. Musicians, artists, people who might be having financial difficulties, but who have just as much right to be treated with respect as your wealthy customers." Miles's voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable edge of anger. "You assumed I was worthless because I looked poor. You were willing to insult and dismiss me based on nothing but my appearance. What does that say about you as a human being?" Peterson was clearly devastated by the realization of what he had done. He had not only insulted a customer, but he had revealed his own prejudices in the worst possible way. "Mr. Davis, I sincerely apologize," Peterson said. "You're absolutely right, and I'm ashamed of how I treated you. Please let me make this right." Miles looked at Peterson for a long moment before responding. "You can make it right by remembering this moment the next time someone walks into your store who doesn't look like your typical customer. Judge people by their character and their knowledge, not by their clothes or their bank account." Peterson brought out the $85,000 trumpet, a magnificent instrument made by a master craftsman and representing the pinnacle of brass instrument manufacturing. As Miles examined the trumpet, his expertise was immediately apparent to anyone watching. He tested the valves, checked the intonation, and played several passages that demonstrated both the instrument's quality and his own extraordinary skill. "This is a beautiful instrument," Miles said after thoroughly testing it. "I'll take it." As Peterson processed the transaction, other customers and employees in the store began to realize what had happened. Word spread quickly that Miles Davis was in the store and that he had just conducted an extraordinary demonstration of how appearance-based prejudice affected customer service. The story of Miles's experiment at Peterson's Music spread rapidly through Chicago's music community and eventually reached national attention. Musicians who heard the story shared their own experiences with discrimination based on appearance, and the incident became part of broader discussions about prejudice and social justice. Peterson's music actually benefited from the incident in unexpected ways. Peterson's willingness to acknowledge his mistake and learn from it, combined with the attention the story brought to his store, made Peterson's music a destination for musicians who appreciated the lesson that had been taught there. Peterson himself was profoundly changed by the encounter with Miles. He implemented new training procedures for his employees that emphasized treating all customers with respect, regardless of their appearance. And he became an advocate for more inclusive practices throughout the music retail industry. The $85,000 trumpet became one of Miles's most prized instruments, and he played it regularly for the rest of his career. But more importantly, the story of how he acquired it became a powerful teaching tool about the importance of looking beyond appearances and treating all people with dignity and respect. Miles continued to speak about the Peterson's Music incident in interviews and conversations with other musicians. He used the story to illustrate how prejudice operated in everyday situations and how successful people had a responsibility to challenge discrimination wherever they encountered it. The experiment also influenced Miles's approach to his own interactions with people, having experienced firsthand how it felt to be dismissed and insulted based on appearance. He became more conscious of how he treated others and more committed to judging people by their character rather than their circumstances. Music educators began using the Peterson's Music story as a teaching tool for discussions about prejudice, respect, and the importance of treating all customers and students fairly. The story illustrated how assumptions based on appearance could lead to missed opportunities and damaged relationships. The broader music industry also took notice of the incident, and it contributed to discussions about making music retail and education more inclusive and welcoming to people from all backgrounds. The story became part of training materials for music store employees and educational programs for music students. Years later, Peterson would describe the encounter with Miles as one of the most important learning experiences of his life. He credited the incident with opening his eyes to his own prejudices and motivating him to become a better person and business owner. The trumpet that Miles purchased that day remains special, not just because of its musical qualities, but because of the story behind its acquisition. It served as a reminder that true worth isn't determined by external appearances, and that respect should be given based on human dignity rather than social status. Contemporary musicians continue to cite the Peterson's music incident as an example of how established artists can use their success to highlight social issues and promote positive change. The story demonstrates that famous people have opportunities to educate others and challenge prejudice in ways that can have lasting impact. The psychological impact of the experiment on Miles himself was profound and lasting. Having experienced discrimination firsthand gave him deeper empathy for people who face such treatment regularly. This experience influenced his subsequent activism and his willingness to speak out about social justice issues throughout his career. The story also became part of broader cultural conversations about the homeless crisis in American cities during the 1960s. Miles's experiment highlighted how society's treatment of homeless individuals reflected deeper prejudices about worth, dignity, and human value. Music industry executives who heard about the Peterson's incident began examining their own practices regarding how musicians were treated based on their appearance or perceived economic status. Several major record labels implemented new guidelines for their employees about professional respect and non-discrimination. The incident influenced the development of anti-discrimination policies in music retail establishments across the country. Many stores began training their employees to treat all customers with respect, regardless of appearance, and some implemented specific protocols for handling situations where customers might be judged unfairly. Educational institutions also incorporated the Peterson's music story into their curricula for business ethics, social psychology, and music industry studies. The incident provided a concrete example of how prejudice operated in real-world commercial settings. Social workers and advocates for homeless populations found the story particularly powerful because it demonstrated how discrimination affected not just material opportunities, but also human dignity and self-respect. The Peterson's incident became part of training materials for service providers. The recording industry's response was complex, as executives recognized that their own practices might reflect similar biases about how successful musicians should look and behave. Some companies began re-examining their marketing strategies and artist development programs. Miles's decision to spend $85,000 on a single instrument also sparked discussions about artistic priorities and the relationship between financial success and creative expression. The fact that he chose to make such a substantial purchase immediately after experiencing discrimination demonstrated his commitment to excellence despite social obstacles. The craftsmanship of the $85,000 trumpet became legendary among brass instrument manufacturers and players. The instrument represented the pinnacle of trumpet-making art, and Miles's ownership of it elevated its status within the musical community. Peterson's music experienced both positive and negative consequences from the incident. While some customers were impressed by Peterson's willingness to learn from his mistake, others questioned whether his behavior reflected deeper institutional problems. The story influenced the development of diversity and inclusion programs throughout the retail industry. Corporate training programs began using the Peterson's incident as a case study in unconscious bias and customer service excellence. Miles's use of the trumpet in subsequent performances added another layer of meaning to the instrument's significance. Every time audiences heard him play it, They were reminded of the story behind its acquisition and the broader social issues it represented. The incident also affected how other famous musicians approached their own interactions with service providers and business establishments. Many began paying attention to how they were treated compared to other customers, and speaking out when they witnessed discriminatory behavior. The story's impact on young musicians was particularly significant, as it taught them that artistic excellence and social consciousness could be combined effectively. Many aspiring artists were inspired by Miles's willingness to use his success as a platform for challenging injustice. The long-term relationship between Miles and Peterson evolved into something resembling mutual respect and understanding. Peterson credited the encounter with Miles as a turning point in his personal development, while Miles acknowledged Peterson's genuine efforts to change his attitudes. Music historians began incorporating the Peterson's incident into their accounts of Miles's career and its broader social significance. The story became part of the narrative about how jazz musicians use their art and their platforms to challenge social injustice. Contemporary discussions about homelessness and social justice continue to reference the Peterson's incident as an example of how successful individuals can use their privilege to highlight systemic problems and promote positive change. The trumpet itself became a symbol not just of musical excellence, but of social justice and human dignity. Miles's decision to purchase such an expensive instrument immediately after experiencing discrimination demonstrated his refusal to be diminished by prejudice. If this story of challenging prejudice, teaching respect through action, and how true worth isn't measured by appearance moved you, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with anyone who has experienced judgment based on appearance, anyone who believes in treating all people with dignity, or anyone who understands that respect should be earned through character rather than circumstances. Let us know in the comments. The lasting legacy of the Peterson's music incident extends beyond the immediate lesson about appearance-based discrimination. The story became a touchstone for discussions about human dignity, social justice, and the responsibility successful individuals have to use their privilege for positive change. The experiment demonstrated that prejudice operates at multiple levels, affecting not just formal institutions, but also everyday interactions. Miles' willingness to subject himself to discrimination showed personal courage that inspired other artists. The $85,000 trumpet purchase highlighted the economic dimensions of discrimination, showing how prejudice could affect business opportunities. Peterson's initial dismissal of Miles could have cost him a significant sale, illustrating how discrimination works against those who practice it. Music educators continue to use the Peterson story to teach students about the importance of respect, professionalism, and the dangers of making assumptions about people based on superficial characteristics. The incident provides an example of how personal biases can interfere with judgment. The story remains relevant for discussions about homelessness, poverty, and inequality. Miles's experiment highlighted how society's treatment of homeless individuals reflects broader attitudes about human worth that affect social policy.